So, good morning and welcome to today's webinar presentation by Stephen Pollard, Locating Zero Emissions, an ethnographic comparison of local approaches to community scale carbon neutrality. This webinar is hosted by the Energy Transition Hub and the Climate and Energy College at the University of Melbourne. My name is John Wiseman and I'll be your moderator for this event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which we are joining this webinar. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be joining the webinar today. Today's webinar is Stephen Pollard's PhD completion seminar. I've had the privilege, along with Monica Minigal, of being Stephen's supervisor. Stephen has a background in anthropology, completing his undergraduate degree at the University of Adelaide and honours at the University of Melbourne. He holds a Master of Environment, also from Melbourne, focused on urban planning and environmental policy. And he's worked in public policy in a range of areas, including planning, environment, and climate change. Stephen will talk for a total of about 40 minutes, and then there'll be time for about 20 minutes of questions. Please submit your questions throughout the presentation by clicking on chat, writing your question, and clicking the raise hand button. Finally, I need to let you know that this seminar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be available on the college website in the next few days. I'm now delighted to welcome Stephen to give his presentation. Stephen, over to you.
Great, thank you, John, for that really kind introduction. Hello, everyone. I can see there's more and more people joining. I'm going to do something technical here and share my screen. And hopefully what you will all see is perhaps still a picture of me talking, and hopefully the sound is good. And hopefully you'll also see a slide, which is the cover slide for this presentation. I'm really pleased to have so many people tuning in to this broadcast today. I'd like to start by echoing John's acknowledgement that I am broadcasting from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri. These lands have never been ceded, and I would like to pay my respects. I'd like to really give a heartfelt thank you to John Weissman and to my co-supervisor, Monica Minigal, and also the chair of my advisory panel, Brendan Gleeson. They will be sort of watching this seminar today. This is a pretty big milestone for a PhD. And of course, no one ever sort of does a PhD entirely on their own. There's a huge number of people that I would just like to take a moment to call out and thank. Firstly, the Australian German Climate Energy College and the Energy Transition Hub for hosting this seminar. A huge shout out to Natasha for organising this webinar format. We're all sort of getting used to this high-tech world, and I'm very pleased to be able to share this presentation in a public way, even though it's not the way that I imagined. Gratitude also to my colleagues at the college in the faculty and more broadly. I've been really privileged to share this PhD journey with some pretty wonderful people. I have to acknowledge the financial support that I've received for this project from the Australian Government Research Training Program, and also through an Australian Endeavour Research Fellowship, which supported my fieldwork in Copenhagen in 2018, and also financial and administrative support from the Melbourne School of Design, as well as some really great institutional support from the University of Melbourne and the University of Copenhagen. And speaking of which, I'm very grateful to Professor Jens Hoff in Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen, who kindly hosted my stay in Copenhagen in 2018. And also a big hello to colleagues and friends over there. Now, thanks really especially to my family for precisely too much love and support through this whole journey. My partner Kate and my children and our COVID kitty perhaps tuned into this seminar at the other end of the house. If I'm like many of you watching, we're all juggling a whole lot of different responsibilities at the moment. So I appreciate, as an audience, taking time out of your days to tune into this seminar. I'd also like to say hi to my mum. Hi, Mum, who's tuning in from Adelaide, and to my sister over there, and especially like to acknowledge my dad. Now, last but not least at all, I owe a really enormous thanks to the generous contributions of time, experience, knowledge, and insights granted by my research participants here in Australia and also in Denmark. And it goes without saying that the knowledge and insights generated through this study are owed to all of you, but the mistakes are just mine. So just signposting this seminar, I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, and I'm going to begin with some context for the study. Then I'll briefly introduce my 3 field sites and foreshadow my research questions and key concepts. And then I'll provide a bit of a high-level methodological framing for the inquiry and also highlight some key literature before going into describe my research methods. With the remaining time, about the second half of the seminar, I'm going to unpack my research questions and share some glimpses from my empirical analysis. So due to limited time, this is only a really brief and schematic overview of the study, and I encourage you to type in comments and questions for afterwards, and there should be some time to address at least some of those. Just a note on the images, these are mostly taken during fieldwork, and they don't always align directly with the text, but they're meant to add some colour and interest to the webinar and convey something of the places at the core of this inquiry. So the concept of global net zero emissions is something that we have all become familiar with. It's become a very powerful unifying narrative that connects the science and policy of climate change. The 2015 Paris Agreement marked a moment of consensus between nation states on the need to achieve net zero emissions by the second half of the century. While many national governments have been slow to act, a growing number of non-state actors have made voluntary commitments for net zero emissions in their own spheres of activity and domains of authority and influence. Thus, a certain harmony has emerged around global net zero emissions as an overarching goal in climate governance. That is, efforts to govern the human activities that contribute to climate change and the social, technical and ecological systems in which they're embedded. But there's a dissonance between this global scale of the objective and the spread of actors, organisations and institutions that are struggling with its delivery. To speak of net zero emissions is to draw attention to boundaries between sources and sinks of greenhouse gases. Achieving net zero emissions requires difficult choices about how and where to curb emissions relative to protecting and enhancing carbon sinks. And while the climate system is global, these sources and sinks of emissions are situated in discrete locations and varied contexts. Thus, the narrative of global net zero emissions becomes differentiated at less than global scales, as the meanings of what counts as net zero emissions, the changes seen as appropriate and necessary to support this outcome, and the actors responsible for these changes emerge differently in different contexts and places. This study examined the way choices are being made about how and where to balance sources and sinks of greenhouse gases by investigating how policy actors translate the concept of global net zero emissions into local goals for community scale carbon neutrality and processes of socio-technical change being enacted as they seek to achieve these goals. I focus on local settings because the geographic territories overseen by local governments are small relative to the human activities and socio-technical and ecological systems that emit and absorb greenhouse gases. And this throws processes to delineate boundaries around carbon neutrality into relief. The study is based on an ethnographic comparison of 3 places where policy actors had expressed and are actively pursuing commitments for community scale carbon neutrality. The City of Copenhagen intends to be the first capital city in the world to become carbon neutral by 2025. The City of Melbourne in 2003 announced its goal to achieve zero net emissions across its municipal area with a target date of 2020. A target date of 2020, although in 2018 the strategy was wholly refreshed and the target date was extended. Byron Shire is striving to become Australia's first regional community to achieve zero emissions by 2025. While all 3 jurisdictions have clear commitments to carbon neutrality, each is acting in locally specific social and material landscapes. Furthermore, policy actors in the 3 field sites had each planned a different approach after reducing emissions as much as possible to neutralise any remaining emissions. In its inaugural strategy, the City of Melbourne's preferred approach was for a municipal carbon trading scheme. The City of Copenhagen has employed a carbon accounting method where exports of surplus wind energy are counted as an offset because they displace emissions from fossil fuels that would otherwise be burnt to generate electricity. And in Byron Shire, the goal expressed was for net zero emissions within the geographic boundaries of the Shire by sequestering carbon locally, such as through reforestation and regenerative agriculture. The overall aim of this thesis is to generate understandings of how low carbon futures are collectively imagined, how boundaries are defined around net zero emissions, and how processes of socio-technical change are enacted towards these goals. The inquiry is guided by 4 research questions, and each question is underpinned by an analytic concept, italicised in this slide. And these are drawn from the fields of anthropology and STS, also called Science and Technology Studies or Science, Technology and Society. Now, I'll come back to these questions later, so read them if you have time, but also don't worry if you lose them. Because the thesis draws these concepts together as an analytic scaffold to understand the common processes and situated contingencies of climate governance. So later in the second half of the seminar, I'll address each of these questions in turn, guided by these concepts, and I'll illustrate with empirical material from my fieldwork. But first, I'd like to step back a little and frame my approach to this inquiry, and then highlight some key areas of literature and outline my research methods. The inquiry is built upon the recognition that knowledge is always situated. I've applied a critical realist perspective that while things of the world are not made up, we can only know the world through the connections to which we pay attention. Processes of global climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and their anthropogenic causes exist. The ways in which these things come to be known and responded to, however, are historic, contingent, and changing. The purpose of this study is not to define global net zero emissions as a singular goal with an optimal solution, or evaluate a best practice approach to local climate governance, or develop generalisable explanations or predictions of how socio-technical change occurs. Nor is it to offer interpretations of how these processes have unfolded based on reasons that are entirely specific to a time, a place, or a set of actors. Rather, I'm interested in what stays the same and what changes as contexts and circumstances change in these efforts to imagine and enact community-scale carbon neutrality. Of course, there are winners and losers in projects to alter and to resist alterations of human activities and the wider systems in which these activities are embedded, highlighting power as an important dynamic in climate governance. While power is one of the elements at play in how policy actors define boundaries around and seek to implement goals for net zero emissions, the research presented here is not primarily a study of how power dynamics shape multi-level climate governance. Instead, this study foregrounds the situated contexts, processes, and relationships through which discourses and practices of net zero emissions are taking shape. Turning now to highlight some key areas of literature, scholarship on multi-level climate governance has drawn sustained attention to the role of local governments and transnational municipal networks in responses to climate change. Research in this field, which overlaps with political science, critical urban theory, and sustainability transitions, engages with the roles played by these actors to effect changes to many layered structures of climate governance, as well as to the human activities and socio-technical systems that produce emissions, the material concentrations of cities and urban areas where these activities and systems are embedded. And yet what's highlighted through this literature is that the extent to which cities and those acting on their behalf are seen as contributing to the causes or solutions to climate change remain ambiguous and contested. One way to approach these ambiguities is to recognise that cities and localities are spatially concentrated nodes situated within globally connected networks. Conversely, climate change is a global phenomenon, but its effects are experienced locally. Processes of globalisation and urbanisation connect locally situated activities and socio-technical systems to global climate change, yet these connections are not everywhere the same. They're differentiated at less than global scales. It takes power to simplify and demarcate a world of hybridity. Methodological and analytic approaches that naturalise scales and categories, such as global and local, cities and urban, may overlook processes of cultural production through which these scales and categories are established, maintained, and contested. Turning to my investigation, by the end of 2016, there were 26 local jurisdictions reporting voluntary commitments for net zero emissions across their local communities, with this goal expressed in 15 different ways, and those are listed on the left of this slide. Close review of policy discourses about these goals and strategies revealed substantial variations in how community-scale carbon neutrality was defined and how policy actors proposed to go about achieving it. These findings from my scoping research suggested that this category of community scale carbon neutrality is undergoing a process of formation on the margins of discursive stability where indistinct, overlapping, and potentially discrepant kinds of meaning making converge. Based on these initial findings, I designed my research as an ethnographic comparison of local approaches to community scale carbon neutrality. I selected Byron, Shire and Copenhagen and Melbourne as field sites for 4 reasons. Number 1, they had amongst the nearest term timeframes to achieve their goals, which suggested that policy and decision-making processes would be actively underway during the research period. Number 2, they expressed distinctive boundaries around their carbon neutral goals, which I touched on earlier. The third reason was that they were situated in different social, economic and political landscapes. And rather than attempting to control variables or smooth out differences by selecting places that seemed alike through research design, I wanted to reveal how contexts may shape different approaches and what remains common despite situated differences. And the fourth reason is that I selected 3 jurisdictions as opposed to 4 or 10 or 26 in order to allow time for in-depth ethnographic fieldwork in each place while going beyond a 2 case study comparison that might tend towards binary distinctions such as urban versus rural, weak versus powerful, large versus small, and so on. The places at the core of this inquiry are locally situated and at the same time part of globally connected networks. To evoke the significance of these situated connections, this thesis brings together a series of local perspectives on global issues while making explicit the situations and relationships that shape these perspectives. Ethnographic research is fundamentally concerned with the negotiation of meaning, not only between people, but also with the material world. It is ideally suited to a study concerned with investigating flux and change rather than identifying stable essences. My investigation did not seek to uncover definitive stories of my field sites or make unequivocal claims to knowledge regarding local climate governance. Rather, I set out to explore how policy actors think about and engage with global climate change and community scale carbon neutrality. Comparison between the 3 field sites gave the study momentum because discovering something significant in one place always prompted questions about its significance in other places. And this approach forced my engagement with processes that are complex, dynamic, and messy rather than clear and certain, while at the same time drawing attention to patterns that held across different contexts. I undertook fieldwork between March 2017 and June 2019 with extensive periods in each site. My encounters were different in each place, but broadly commensurate. In the field, I conducted 48 semi-structured research interviews spread fairly evenly across the field sites. And these were with policy practitioners, councillors, consultants, and community activists involved in local climate governance in various ways. I engaged in participant observation in each place by joining into and critically observing daily life, attending events and public consultations, and talking with people about my research and about their lives. I generated field notes from these interactions for reflection, analysis, and thick description. That is, descriptive and evocative stories crafted to convey situated meanings and narrative flows of events that highlight patterns of human action and interaction that, while specific to social and material contexts, are also intelligible across contexts. So thanks for bearing with me through all of that. With the remaining time, I'll address my 4 research questions through those 4 analytic concepts mentioned earlier. And I'll ground this in some glimpses from my empirical analysis. Just to reiterate, this is really skimming the surface, but I'd be happy to take some comments and questions at the end. Different bodies of literature have foregrounded one or other of these 4 focal concepts. In-depth analysis through each of these conceptual lenses in 3 different field sites generates insights into the common processes through which policy actors envision and enact goals for net zero emissions. Equally, this analytic approach reveals the ways in which different contexts and relationships may shape these processes, highlighting locally situated contingencies in processes of sociotechnical change. Chapter 4 of my thesis examines the conditions of possibility in which socio-technical imaginaries of community-scale carbon neutrality are seen as viable and desirable, and seen so by whom in each field site. Sociotechnical imaginaries are collectively held, institutionally stabilised, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures, animated by shared understandings of social life and social order that are attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. Multiple sociotechnical imaginaries can be in play at any one time, perhaps emerging from the visions of a single individual or a group and gathering adherents through exertions of power or persistent efforts to build coalitions until they are communally adopted. In each field site, future-oriented goals for carbon neutrality emerge within a unique set of social and material and historic circumstances, discourses and alliances. To illustrate, this figure shows the material elements of the Copenhagen energy system that are being reconfigured towards carbon neutral city objectives. The viability of the carbon neutral vision was underpinned by two technological interventions: upgrading and converting the extensive district heat and power network to run on biomass instead of coal, about here, and investing in wind turbines to generate renewable energy, up here. Now, of course, these aren't the only socio-technical changes involved in the Copenhagen climate plan, but they do account for the largest portion of emissions reductions. The desirability of this vision centred on promoting Copenhagen as a city with climate solutions for the world, while promising not to disrupt, and indeed to make better, Copenhagen's everyday lives and experiences in the city. In Melbourne and Byron Shire, goals for carbon neutrality have been shaped by different contexts. The City of Melbourne has consistently foregrounded the desirable economic opportunities of moving first and early on climate actions, aligned with its aspirations as a world city, and equally has highlighted the costs of failing to act on climate change. The viability of this vision was underpinned through early iterations of Melbourne's strategy by strong expectations for carbon markets. More recently, however, large-scale renewable energy projects have overtaken carbon trading as a preferred strategy to realise large emissions reductions. In Byron Shire, the push for local climate action has been strongest from the grassroots, in concert with desires for local autonomy and community-owned renewable energy projects, and against corporate power. Each of these imaginaries is locally situated and must be made meaningful and must be seen as viable and desirable in order to gain adherence, take hold, and redirect trajectories of socio-technical change. As the concept of global net zero emissions is translated from universal ideal into locally situated formulations, boundaries are delineated to anchor these goals in place. Chapter 5 addresses how practices to define boundaries around community scale carbon neutrality co-produce structures, objects, and agents of local climate governance, and situate these practices in relation to wider institutional structures across national and international levels. The idea of co-production draws attention to symmetries between the ways that people organise and govern themselves and the ways that nature and society are perceived and understood. This is because knowledge is always socially situated. Knowledge of the world is shaped by, and in turn shapes, the social supports in which it is produced and held. To illustrate, in the lead up to the 2015 Paris Agreement, the participation of local actors in international climate governance grew substantially. More than 1,000 local mayors went to Paris to attend the climate summit for local leaders, pictured here, with the intent to push ambition at the climate conference. The statement from this summit commits local leaders to deliver up to 3.7 gigatons of urban greenhouse gas emissions reductions annually by 2030, the equivalent of up to 30% of the difference between current national commitments and the 2-degree emissions reduction pathway identified by the scientific community. The combined pledge was based on standard methods of municipal carbon accounting that establish a consistent approach to estimate emission sources and removals at the municipal level. Standard practices of carbon accounting stabilise carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e, as an object of climate governance across different sites and scales. This contributes to the production of the local as an abstracted scale of climate governance, and also supports the legitimacy of local governments as agents responsible for governing carbon at that scale. While these practices stabilise objects, agents, and structures of climate governance, boundaries delineated around the community scale must always, to some extent, attend to local specificities. Byron Shire's conceptual boundaries are aimed at internalising carbon towards realising self-sufficiency, but these edges are permeated by the high number of visitors to the region each year. The City of Copenhagen's conceptual boundaries allow exports of surplus wind energy to be counted as a carbon offset from turbines owned by the city's utility company, wherever those turbines are located. However, the value of these exports is diminishing over time as the emissions factor of the Nordic electricity grid is pushed down by increasing shares of renewable energy. The City of Melbourne has initially explored a municipal carbon trading scheme and purchasing carbon offsets to help achieve carbon neutrality, effectively importing credits from projects that sequester carbon or avoid emissions elsewhere. Boundaries anchor carbon neutral imaginaries to a locality and stabilise carbon across other sites and scales. Reducing emissions and enacting carbon neutrality requires human activities, technologies and natures to be reconfigured. Chapter 6 addresses how carbon neutrality is scaled, negotiated and contested through efforts to assemble new connections between people, technologies and natures. The idea of an assemblage differs from other ways to think about interconnections between social and material elements. A network is a grid of interconnected elements, directing attention to linkages but lacking focus. A group is defined by its edges, that is, the boundary between inside and outside, directing attention to nodes but overlooking interconnections. Assemblages combine these qualities. They come together around a focal point but extend open-endedly. In this sense, they are always contingent but never bounded. In the City of Melbourne, the CH2 building reflects and embodies wider municipal goals for community scale carbon neutrality. The project is a beacon of central Melbourne and an exemplar of Australian green design. Yet the council's efforts to realise the building as net zero emissions have relied on purchasing carbon offsets and renewable energy, which themselves rest on equivalences asserted through legislative, regulatory and industrial ensembles that extend well beyond the city. While these assemblages of carbon credits and green electricity are a viable way to establish carbon neutrality for council's corporate operations, relying on these same methods to achieve community scale carbon neutrality would involve high recurrent costs and miss out on the potential benefits of reconfiguring sociotechnical systems to reduce emissions locally. So much so that in late 2018, the City of Melbourne redefined the boundaries around its imaginary for the carbon neutral city. In Byron Shire, carbon neutrality is assembled through a patchwork of projects led by a range of actors and driven by a variety of interests. Alongside carbon neutrality, community is also being reconfigured in varied ways, including through cosmopolitan incarnations of the commune and the village, such as the habitat redevelopment, and through community-owned renewable energy projects intended to reshape flows of power, wealth and autonomy. In Copenhagen, the design of the Nordhaven precinct as a car-free and energy self-sufficient district with optimised consumption is dominated by technologies, while in some regards eliding the social relations in which these new technologies are embedded, such that enacting this design has involved some unexpected turns. The carbon assemblages brought together through these projects are open-ended and contingent, unfolding in uncertain directions as people, technologies and nature encounter and connect in new and surprising ways. Chapter 7 addresses the frictions that emerge in efforts to imagine and enact community-scale carbon neutrality, and how these frictions enable, constrain and inflect processes of socio-technical change. Consider the idealised jigsaw of greenhouse gas inventories that join seamlessly across territories and nest neatly across scales. Then consider the messy realities of carbon, people, resources, infrastructures, institutions and meanings that must be reassembled across these neat categories. Friction can help us think about the space between imagined future states, negotiated boundaries, unstable assemblages and indeterminate pathways towards net zero emissions. Friction allows movement, establishing pathways to make motion easier, while at the same time limiting where we go. As Anna Singh puts it, inflecting historic trajectories, enabling, excluding and particularising. The City of Copenhagen faces challenges to reach its carbon neutral target by 2025 and remain there. Efforts to deter cars from the city have been slow to eventuate, and the target to build new wind turbines has been increased to counteract a larger share of transport emissions. But finding places to build these turbines has been difficult within and beyond the city itself. Biomass in the city's heat and power plants is considered carbon neutral in the carbon accounts, but city planners recognise this is not necessarily a solution that the rest of the world ought to adopt. Thus, in Copenhagen, frictions emerge between the promise of technologies and the need to reconfigure society in relation to these technologies, to make them as ubiquitous and meaningful as the bicycle, say. And frictions emerge between the projection of Copenhagen as a city with global solutions and the possibility that some solutions ought not be scaled up, that there's a big enough for some of these approaches. In Melbourne, despite achieving projects like CH2 and the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, friction between the ambitious breadth of the carbon neutral imaginary and limits to the extent of municipal authority have seen the city redefine the spatial and temporal boundaries around its goals. In Byron Shire, congestion in Byron Bay, the plague of potholes throughout the region, and the contested introduction of paid parking signal frictions between locals and visitors over everyday issues that also reflect the challenges of local climate action in a context of global connection. Rather than perceiving friction as a destructive force, friction is what allows things to move in new and often unanticipated directions. This is reflected in the creative ways that policy actors in Copenhagen, Melbourne, and Byron Shire have redrawn boundaries around carbon, reframing discourses, reinvigorating alliances, and redirecting policy efforts as they work to stabilise imagined low-carbon futures in response to shifting circumstances. For example, planners in Copenhagen are already beginning to frame climate policy beyond 2025. A high-level document released in 2015 included the phrase fossil fuel-free Copenhagen by 2050. This new discourse signals that even if it can be achieved, success in 2025 is only partial and contingent. A fossil-free city would encompass everything from the ubiquitous plastic-wrapped food in supermarkets to synthetic clothing fabrics, and those emissions embodied in the manufacture and transport of goods and materials into the city. This imaginary, should it take hold, recasts the boundaries of the carbon neutral city in new directions. In sum, policy actors translate the concept of global net zero emissions into goals for community scale carbon neutrality as collectively imagined futures that are shaped by and generate locally situated meanings. These imaginaries are not fixed but negotiated and contested. Their perceived viability and desirability changes as perspectives, contexts, and circumstances change. Boundaries interposed around these goals are co-produced through ongoing interactions across sites and scales. While the boundaries defined around carbon neutrality differ in each of the field sites, the processes through which they are defined serve to stabilise structures, objects, and agents of climate governance. Carbon assemblages rest on practices that establish and maintain carbon dioxide equivalent as an object that can be governed in these projects, but always unfold in different ways because of the indeterminacy of encounters between people, technologies, and natures. In each case, there are frictions between inside and outside, and between situated and abstract, as policy actors negotiate community-scale carbon neutrality in the grip of global connections. While similar points of friction emerge in each locality, processes of change follow different trajectories as a result. So just to summarise in the last couple of slides, I'll speak about the contributions to knowledge, and I'll speak about the implications of this study. Theoretically, the thesis draws together complementary strands of inquiry within anthropology, STS, and multi-level climate governance to advance an empirically grounded analytic scaffold. It is this heuristic framework, rather than explanatory variables, that can be transferred to generate insights into processes and practices related to net zero emissions in other places and at other scales. In terms of methods, ethnographic comparison between these places highlights common processes and interactions, as well as situated contingencies. From an empirical perspective, the thesis contributes rich observations and descriptions of specific efforts to collectively imagine and enact low-carbon futures. Telling stories about policy actors who are ambitious but not always successful in the face of significant challenges and shifting circumstances is a way to acknowledge their creativity and inventiveness and draw attention to the messy realities of imagining and enacting local responses to global climate change. And with the final slide, approaching discourses and practices related to net zero emissions through this heuristic framework as relational and locally specific allows us to learn from and imagine other ways of pursuing low carbon futures in response to climate change. Collective processes to envision and enact low carbon futures start from different points and may head in different directions. Spatial and conceptual boundaries delineated to anchor and guide these pathways are not fixed and determinate, but negotiated and contested. From a pragmatic perspective, the comparison illustrates that best practice approaches to local climate governance are always shaped, to some extent, by specific contexts and must be periodically and reflexively adjusted to shifting circumstances. Thus, while it is possible to better understand processes to imagine and enact low carbon futures, they cannot be reduced to explanation or predicted by way of determining variables. And nor is it possible to think of any single approach to carbon neutrality as being strictly reproducible or scalable. These findings also have implications for how we might think about global net zero emissions, not as an abstract and stable future planetary state, but as a heterogeneous and dynamic patchwork of social and material assemblages that connect people, technologies, and natures in new ways. Thus, the thesis contributes a way to understand and learn from these processes to imagine and enact low carbon futures. Thanks everyone for tuning in and bearing with me through that presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting, and look forward to responding to some questions and interacting a little bit more with you all in this format.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So you've been wonderful in keeping to time, well done. And we do have a number of questions, some of which are from people who are still with us and some have had to leave, and I'll ask questions on their behalf, but please, if you've got further questions, please put them in the chat. So the first question is from Lynette Smith, and I'm hoping Lynette's actually able to ask this question directly herself.
Yes, here I am. Can you hear and see me? Yep.
Yes.
Good. All right. So you mentioned collective processes there, Stephen, and so I'm wondering about the democratic properties of those collective processes. Anyway, so what I actually wrote down in my question was different agents have different power as well as different imaginaries, and this means that some imaginaries win, so to speak. So my question is about the part that democratic instruments play in ensuring that imaginaries jostle in with productive friction.
It's a great question. I mean, I could respond by saying yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Perhaps if I offer an example from some of the fieldwork that I did, it could illustrate the point that you're making, which is quite right. Some imaginaries win over others. Power, you know, and negotiation and contestation is a huge part of these processes. The example I'm thinking of is with City of Melbourne, which you know, has had these zero net strategies in play as part of its suite of environmental and urban policies for almost the last 20 years, and sort of generated, you know, in collaboration, in consultation with citizens and stakeholders through the city. There's a democratic process of elections to elect councillors, and we could go into how that looks different in different sort of municipalities within Melbourne and more broadly. But there was also a process that City of Melbourne undertook some years ago through its Future Melbourne Committee that was more of a sort of citizens jury to sort of look at all kinds of policy issues in the city. And that kind of elevated, again, environmental issues and climate change as a really high priority. But one of the things that came up in some of my interviews with policy actors in City of Melbourne is how that sort of citizens jury process, you know, could be seen to sit in tension with the process of democratically electing councillors and representatives. So there are these different processes to sort of come to collective decisions. They don't always sit neatly with each other, and they do jostle with each other for sort of precedence and power.
Thank you, Stephen. So my next question I'm asking on behalf of Jeremy Baskin, who is doing some homeschooling, I think. So he's asked me to ask on his behalf. And his question is, do any of the three sites also have explicit policies in relation to economic growth? And if so, how do they bring together this element of their imaginary with the net zero imaginary? So it's a question about the relationship between imaginaries of growth and imaginaries of net zero emissions.
Got it. It's a really key question, and it ties in really strongly to some of that literature that I highlighted in the first part of the talk, in terms of multi-level climate governance and in terms of this sort of ambiguity and tension between whether cities are contributing to climate change problems or solutions, and the sort of issue of growth is a huge one there. And there's a really sort of rich literature in this space that looks at some of these cities such as Copenhagen, which has managed to decouple in some of the sort of analyses, decouple economic growth and population growth from its emissions growth. And yet at the same time, there's other analyses that point to the really high levels of consumption, the high levels of wealth, that might actually suggest that a lot of that emissions growth has really just been sort of exported elsewhere to countries through globalisation that have taken on a whole lot of the manufacturing and industrial processes for richer countries and richer cities. So it is a really difficult issue. Looking at the way boundaries are defined around net zero emissions in these places is one way to untangle it. But it's also quite contested, and I think it's one of those subjects that a whole lot of tensions and frictions emerge in terms of how a net zero emissions or a low carbon narrative might fit within or not fit within a sort of economic growth imaginary, which is also a pretty sort of powerful narrative in our societies.
Thank you. And also a question from Kathy Oak, who's had to go to another Zoom call. And her question is, which of these city approaches do you think will allow those cities to best continue to prioritise climate action ambitions within the constraints they now find themselves in due to COVID-19? So this is adding the COVID-19 imaginary to your story. Do you want to have a go at that?
Look, I'll have a go. I mean, this is a big question, and I haven't touched on COVID-19, but I think that it, it's one of these sort of illustrations of the way that we've all been affected by something global. This sort of pandemic and the movement of this virus has affected, each of us, our households, our families, our workplaces in quite unique ways. So it highlights the sort of local and global connections. I think it would be sort of premature for me to sort of offer any commentary on how cities might adjust. It's sort of exciting and inspiring to see the way, with less sort of movement of people through these concentrated urban centres, some cities have jumped on that as an opportunity to sort of recreate pedestrian spaces and cycling spaces. So there is, in some sense, some alignment between the response to the virus and also the sort of environmental and climate imaginaries and policies that policy actors are pursuing. But I'm sure that there's also some sort of negatives and some challenges that are coming out of it as well. So I would say it's a really good question. It's the subject of probably multiple PhDs, but it's worth all of us giving some thought to.
Okay, I think the next question is from Fungai Muzawazi. Can you go ahead? Hello?
See the question in the chat?
Yeah, do you want to, you can see it in the chat, Stephen. Do you want to read it out and answer it?
The question from Fungai is, just wanted to know what binds the communities together and what separates them. Melbourne and Copenhagen seem to be huge entities to be defined as a single ethnographic entity. Thank you, Fungai. That's a really good question. It's a really interesting one. One of the things that I've been interested in with the concept of community scale carbon neutrality is how it sort of, enables and performs community in new ways. Of course, when I'm talking about the City of Melbourne here, it's one small municipality of 32 municipalities within Greater Metropolitan Melbourne. And living in Melbourne, I feel a part of the city, at least as much as I feel a part of the municipality. But I also feel a part of community in various other ways. The same could be said in Copenhagen and Byron Shire, like, how we feel part of communities as individuals and families and in our workplaces, it's shifting, it's not always the same. So towards your question, I suppose, what this community scale in community scale carbon neutrality is doing is really just defining a category around community scale, akin to the local scale. So this is a scale of climate governance, and it's a scale where local governments and local actors, can be seen as really legitimate actors in trying to reshape relationships around carbon. But of course, in trying to enact those policies and sort of, make changes, the communities that they're dealing with are not single entities. And that's where I think a lot of the issues that I've found in relation to assemblages and frictions have been useful to draw out, that things don't go as planned, communities aren't all homogenous, but there's always some sort of indeterminacy and uncertainty in how policies will actually unfold.
Okay, so there's still, I think, a couple of people trying to type into the chat, but can I ask you a question, which a number of people have asked me, and it's the kind of policy, I guess, asking you to expand on the policy implications of what your research, and maybe I'll put it like this: if you were speaking to for argument's sake, a premier or a mayor of a large Australian city, and they said, "What's the key takeaways from your research that I should, if not take to cabinet, at least take to my colleagues?" What would be your answer? How would you describe the key policy takeaways?
Look, I think the really key point for thinking about this goal for net zero emissions at any scale or in any context is to recognise that it's dynamic and it's contingent. So to take the example of Victoria's sort of net zero emissions by 2050 policy, for example, I mean, how we sort of get to this point here in the state where we're located is going to look a little different depending on sort of where you're starting from in the state, which sectors, which geographic location. There's different starting points. The end point when we get to net zero emissions is always going to be continually unfolding and dynamic. So we're not going to ever reach a stable state of net zero emissions. We're going to reach a dynamic and continually unfolding state. And so that requires a policy that's sort of reflexive and recursive and periodically reviewed to understand how this balance between sources and sinks of emissions is going to be achieved, how the process to achieve that has to be adjusted as assumptions and circumstances adjust. And so it's really not a situation of set and forget policy. It's a situation of sort of continual monitoring and reflection and so on.
All right. Well, I think we might finish up there. I think a number of people have had to go off to other Zoom calls and that sort of thing. So in a minute, I'll pass on my thanks and we'll finish up. But just before we do, I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of forthcoming hub and college seminars. Yes, and you'll see those on the slide now. So on Wednesday, the 27th of May, Alex Lehman from Flow Power and Marica Petkovic from Energy Synapse will be speaking about industrial demand response. And on Thursday, the 4th of June, Kennedy Mbeva will be speaking on the politics of trade and environment linkages. Please make sure you've registered on the Energy Transition Hub and the Climate College if you'd like to be kept informed of future events. But for now, I'd like to conclude by thanking Stephen and everyone who's joined and asked questions and been part of the conversation. Well done, Stephen. And we look forward to talking further and welcoming others to future hub and college seminars. Thanks, everybody, and have a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you.